I hope you are all fed and watered here and enjoying those snacks. I did want to make a note that those of you in the audience, I'm sure you have plenty of thoughts yourselves and questions for Cristina Lafont and our other speakers today. Hold on to those questions, write them down, because after this session, we will be having one final conversation with Cristina Lafont in which you will have a chance to ask those general questions. But before we do that, we did want to take one more chance to bring a few more voices into the conversation. So again, you have full bios for each of these panelists in your handouts, but just a little note on each of them and kind of the reasons that they feel like an important part of this conversation. So Simone Gubler is a professor of philosophy at UNC whose work specifically has to do with morality and institutions. And I think something that's become evident in all of our conversations is that democracy doesn't work unless it works through and with institutions. That feels especially important as we're having that conversation today at a large state institution. Next, we'll be joined by Natasha Miller, who is an amazing educator who draws on her former career in law and environmental justice in the classroom. And so teaching history and economics gives her a perspective on how democracy plays into educational initiatives, how it translates across generational divides. And she is also currently a America 250 fellow, working on a democracy initiative that is taking place across the country with educators, so she can speak to that. And then last but not least, we will also be joined by Jim Lelutis, who is an expert on the history of voting in North Carolina. So we've been talking a lot on a big picture scale globally, what needs to happen for democracy to succeed. This will be an opportunity for us to do a deep dive on this specific historical context. What does democracy look like in North Carolina? So I hope you'll all join me in welcoming this final panel.
All right, fantastic. So I think I'll kick things off. So I'm a philosopher, and normally what that would mean is that I would stand up here and I would give you some nicely developed arguments. But when I read Professor Lafont's work, I realized something. I actually want to tell you a story instead, because I've participated in what she calls a mini public. So I've participated in a deliberative democracy forum, and there are certain features of it that I think are interesting and that bear on some of the promises that she's elucidated so well for us this weekend. So Professor Lafont tells us that mini publics involve a randomly selected group of citizens who are descriptively representative of the citizenry. They're invited to come together, get informed, and deliberate about some important issue, and to make some recommendations, policy recommendations to state bodies. Now, some years ago in Australia, where I come from, I responded to an advertisement at my local shopping centre. Researchers were looking for a range of city folk to participate in a deliberative democracy experiment. They'd pay the princely sum of $20 and there was a free lunch, okay? And I was a student, so they had me at free lunch. So I called the number, I showed up, and the idea for the experiment was as follows. Participants were selected from two stakeholder groups. So the first group was these city folk, people like me of all different ages, genders, ethnicities, educational backgrounds. And then there was a group of constituents who were rural constituents. So the town that I come from is called Canberra. It has a big kind of farming belt around it. And we share resources between the city and the rural area. And one of the resources that we share is water. And water at that point in time was an increasingly contested resource because we were going through a 10-year drought. And there was the need for some pretty major policy changes. I'm sure this is a familiar story to you here in America, maybe not in the East Coast so much, but certainly this is a debate that goes on in many states in the age of climate change. And so we're all ordinary citizens. Some of us are stakeholders in the city, some of us are stakeholders in the rural area, people from farming backgrounds. And our job was to choose an allocation plan for the city and surrounding farms in the event that the shortages became worse. And there was local government buy-in. So we were told by the researchers that our recommendations would be given to the appropriate authorities and taken very seriously. We believe this. There are about 30 of us in the group, 15 city residents, 15 farmers, and like I said, a range of backgrounds. And over the course of a couple of days, we heard testimony from scientists and academics who researched issues of water allocation and distribution and also environmental costs of those processes. Now, I don't know how much you guys know about Australian society, but I come from a society in which successful people rigorously conceal their success and class status. So there's a norm of being very reticent about your achievements. We're really loath to assert social superiority. There's even a widely recognized social syndrome that describes the tendency to attack those who fail at this kind of important work of concealing your achievements. So we call it tall poppy syndrome. And the idea is if a poppy grows above the rest, you cut it down. And I mean, this is not just Australian culture. In Japan, they have a related saying, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. I think there are cultural cognates in many societies, but it's a very strong norm in Australia. And in the context of the expert testimony, this meant that there was a bit of joking and clowning around on behalf of us, the ordinary people, because having experts here means that they need to be kind of put in their place. And so at one point, and the experts are aware of this. So at one point, one of the experts said something self-deprecating about how I'm such a boring person. And one of the participants shouted out, "Too right, mate." We all laughed. So there was like an interesting kind of social dynamic playing out around expertise and egalitarianism, and it was definitely something that was alive in all of our minds. We're culturally primed for it. But note that even in this cultural context, in a room full of ribald, noisy Australians acting in a fundamentally egalitarian spirit, we still ultimately exhibited a kind of pronounced deference to the experts. None of us really knew very much about water rights and distribution antecedently. I mean, the farming community knew what they wanted, but ultimately the experts were the ones who knew about water rights and water tables and distribution and drought prospects. And so although they did a really fantastic job of dispassionately setting forward the facts for us, we ended up in this situation where once we decamped to deliberate, so without them present, the first thing that one of the farmers said, and I found this absolutely remarkable at the time, and I still do find it remarkable, was, "I think that they wanted us to choose Model 7, the 70-30 distribution with the credit system." And other people weighed in and they said, "Yeah, I think that was what the experts thought was best." And that was where the conversation started. And then we started talking about, our various stakes in the issue, but that's also where the conversation ended. We ended up kind of like epistemically humble, saying, we don't know that much about this, but these people who do seem to think that this was the best thing. They didn't want to tell us that, but we could work it out, And so here's my worry. Where members of a mini public require expert advice, and they often will, they'll be very vulnerable to technocratic capture, even as we were. Now, Lafont is right to hold that autocratic expectation of blind deference is incompatible with democratic inclusion, but I worry that some relatively powerful forms of deference are nonetheless social defaults for all of us. And I kind of wonder what she thinks about that. So these aren't blind forms of deference, but nonetheless very powerfully socially conditioned forms of deference. Even where expert advisors aim and work to avoid the assertion of epistemic authority, we impute it to them. We, the citizens in the mini-public, study them for clues as to how we must act, just as my co-citizens did in the deliberative democracy experiment. We will do it even if we ordinarily adopt egalitarian norms, because it's not at odds with equality to defer to experts. An egalitarian still defers to their doctor in medical situations, to their lawyer in court, and it's frankly good that we do so. If I treated my doctor as kind of like an equal stakeholder in my medical care, things probably wouldn't go so well for me. It's fine to defer. It's rational and desirable to defer to your doctor. And I think that it was also probably rational and desirable for our ragtag group to defer to the water wonks in this deliberative democracy experiment. But then that means that ultimately what I wonder is whether what Professor Lafont is giving us is really technocracy in a more palatable form. It seems to me that the person who is really being empowered in the existence of a mini-public is not the ordinary citizen participant, who's one among many at the end of the day, but the expert who's thereby granted a captive audience for their wisdom. One bulwark against the technocratic capture of the system of mini-publics, Professor Lafont suggests, is the fact that each mini-public may call different experts, so the voice of expertise isn't univocal. But that doesn't undermine the general worry that what we have here is a massive subtle transfer of power from the people to the nerds. And the question I want to leave you with here, since I take it that I'm in a gathering of many nerds, is whether that's such a bad thing. So wouldn't it be nice to have a system of rule by many experts that still had some democratic trappings? It wouldn't be an autocratic system because power is devolved to a wide range of experts acting within their specific spheres of authority, and we, the public, can act as a safeguard against abuse by retaining formal power through the mini-public mechanism. It would be a multipolar technocracy. Even if this system of technocratic mini-publics would come to implement all the same policies as an explicit technocracy might, it would also yield many aspects of the value of democracy. Because the value of democracy isn't found in, or at least it's not exhausted by, its ability to produce positive outcomes for citizens. There are other values, both instrumental and non-instrumental, that we can reasonably hope to see realized in such a system. On the non-instrumental front, we might think that there's some intrinsic democratic value in public justification, right? Habermas tells us this, in having citizens place their imprimatur on policy, even if they produce it in response to expert prompting. We might, moreover, celebrate the liberal and egalitarian values that the mini-public model seems to evince as a matter of symbolic significance. We're bringing together and celebrating citizens. It's a powerful symbolic expression of equality and liberty. And there are also positive cultural consequences that we might imagine arising out of the mini-public system as opposed to an explicit technocracy as well. So, for example, some argue that participatory democracy models have the potential to bring about moral improvements in their participants. And they're the sort of moral improvements that have civic value, they have wide value for the rest of us. And we can think about it, in a mini-public we're asked to talk and think and listen together. Many of you have been sensitive to this fact, and to aim at the common good and justice. And this is the sort of exercise that we should hope, as people who invested in a university, is good for people. It's a sort of exercise that conduces to rationality, to prosociality, to the development of faculties like empathy in company with others. And these beneficial goals might not be the proper goal of a mini-public, but if realized, and of course it's an empirical question whether they would be, this would surely be a happy outcome, and one that might help justify the adoption of the system, even if we take it to be a quasi-technocratic one, as a more desirable thing than the adoption of an explicit technocracy. Okay, those are my comments. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I teach that to my students in world history as 9th graders and 10th graders at STEM Early College at North Carolina A&T. Before teaching at STEM, I taught at Wellborn Academy of Science and Technology, a middle school, and I taught 8th graders U.S. history and emphasis on North Carolina history according to the standards, the state standards. I taught there for 10 years. Wellborn was at the bottom of Gifford County schools as far as testing. We were an F, a low-performing, underperforming school. Yet every day I worked with colleagues who went above and beyond, who went into the neighborhoods, who drove students home, who tutored, who worked tirelessly. But the reality is when students came to us from elementary school, they would come to us in 6th grade at a 3rd grade level. We were then assigned the task of preparing them for EOGs, state testing. And those state tests require that we give a test, administer a test on a 6th grade level, a 7th grade level, an 8th grade level. Therefore, if a child came to us at a 3rd grade level, we had to give them a test at a 6th grade level. Do the math. So for me, coming into education, I came in as this is a 2nd career, 3rd career for me. And when I came in, I was green because I really believed, and I still do, that all children can learn, all students can learn. But really, if you look at the education system, what is education for? For me, I thought we meet students where they are, and then we carry them so that they are actually learning and progressing. So when the last panel said about learning about the divisions or the different branches of our government in 4th grade, well, if that's not on the EOG for 4th grade, they're probably not going to learn it. One of the things that our education system is really struggling with, and the challenge is bringing teachers in, but not only bringing them in, but keeping them. The turnover rate is so big right now. And so I think about that, and when I've listened to and Dr. Lafont talk about democracy and talk about and the panelists sharing in this discussion, a few themes in my mind come to mind. One of the things is fear and faith. For me, working at my school for over a decade could not have happened without my faith. I saw students from all walks of life in all different places, and though we shared the same appearance, they looked like students of color, just like I am a woman of color. We were from two different spectrums. I as an educated woman, and they as not, and their families as not. And so even though they could identify me when they looked at me, we were totally different. But coming into those classrooms, I think every teacher, in order to be successful, has to look at that classroom of diversity, meaning not necessarily by appearance, but what the students bring into that classroom. And they have to have the faith that what I am teaching and what I have prepared for, I am able to distribute and teach to the students, and then they're able to give it back to me. We look at EVOS data. And EVOS data gives us an outline and an expectation of where students will be based on how they performed in the past. That type of EVOS data is to inform our instruction so that we can meet students where they are and grow them. And therefore, when they take state tests, they either will be proficient, they will meet growth, or they will exceed growth. Giving students that understanding of where they are and what the projection of them are empowers the student to have a stake in their success. And then assessing them, giving them a pre-assessment at the beginning of class to really understand where they are, and then having interim assessments throughout the year help us to monitor where they are. And then if we teach what we call a backwards design, we have prepared them. So applying this to what has been said in the conversations is that, one, there has to be a goal. We have to know what the expectation is, what the goal is. And I've heard it can be values, it can be our belief systems, it can be meeting this certain requirement. But without having a goal, we will not be successful, because then we're just aimlessly striving, and there's no success in that. When we look at this stratosphere and what's going on with our government and our practices, we are definitely polarized. But I am, I guess, green again, because I think that our mini publics don't necessarily have to be formal. The mini publics can be in our neighborhoods. They can be in our shopping centers. They can be in our schools. Mini publics mean that I must be able to step out on faith despite what my fear is, and talk to someone who is different from me and believes differently than me, looks differently than me. It means that what my grandmother taught me, what my family taught me in these rural areas of North Carolina and beyond, that I have to set that aside and say, I'm going to believe in something bigger than myself. When I look at that preamble to the Declaration of Independence, that is shaped by Enlightenment ideas and age of reason, there are things that strike me as interesting. The first is we. Who was that we referring to? When our founding fathers wrote that in that wonderful, timeless document, we was an exclusive group that did not include women, did not include children, did not include people of color. It did not include white men who did not own land. When we look at all men, well, where are the women? Where are the children? When we look at creator, does everybody believe in the same thing? And so there are even discrepancies within that timeless piece that's part of our founding documents. Yet, I still believe there is hope. And I have that hope because I believe that there is an innate desire in all of us to be our best. But when we look at where we are in the polarization and the democracy and having a right to vote and voting, I think the question is, do you feel empowered to vote? And if you do not, why is that? Maybe it's because my vote won't make a difference. My vote doesn't really matter. I really don't have a say. And so I believe that's a greater question, and I think that's a greater challenge that we have. And the other part of that is, if I vote and my team loses, who wants to be a loser? You know, it's always better when we can say them, they, and we can find someone who is a little beneath us. It makes us feel better. I see that with my students. I see that when they get a test score and they'll say, what did you make? What did you make? What did you make? And it's all, if someone made worse than them, they feel better. Immediately, they feel like, woo, they've accomplished regardless of what their score is. And so I think that's life. My concern is that we've got to be bigger than that. My concern is that we wanting to be winners. So even if we don't get the outcome that we anticipate or we would like or we would hope for, are we willing to work at our best? And if we can say yes to that, that means that those mini publics can exist and they will exist. I think one of the things that recently, as an America 250 Fellows, I've been thinking about what my project will be. And for me, my project is going to deal with bridges and concepts because I love teaching hard history. I love teaching things that I may not even agree with, but I love putting it out there for the students so that they can have a bigger picture of the story. And so in teaching hard history, when I teach different things, I have students that'll look at me like, oh my goodness, I cannot believe we're learning this. And so in order to prepare them, I use this, bridges. What do we use bridges for? They connect us to different places, depending on how wide or how narrow, how high or how low the bridge is, or how scary it appears, will determine how quickly or which way we attempt to cross it. But one thing is for sure, if we have a bridge between two peaks, in order to get to the other side, we've got to cross the bridge. Some people will cross confidently, others will hold on for dear life. Some will have to crawl and others will have to be led across, and they will go across blindly, believing that they can get across. But one thing is for sure, in order to have that meeting of the minds, something I learned in contractual law, that meeting of the minds, we've got to cross it. And so that concept of crossing a bridge, that's what I see our democracy is right now. We have to have some type of meeting of the minds, some type of way to cross this big divide, this big bridge. When I was in Halifax last week celebrating the Halifax Resolves anniversary, 148th anniversary, April 12, 1776, I went on the Underground Railroad tour. I went down to the river. And one of the things that empowers me is when I looked at that river and I thought about people getting on man-made rafts or just a piece of wood to float and maybe not even knowing how to swim, getting in that river. Once they set foot in that water, it was beginning a taste of freedom. Two people have impressed me, well, three, and I'm going to share some of the things that I've learned from them. From Harriet Tubman, when she said, I could have freed more if only they had known they were slaves. From Jane Goodall, who just celebrated, I think, a 90-something birthday, when she talked about her passion and how it grew to include other things, she mentioned this. Sometimes we are overcome by what's going on in the world, and we have to step back and narrow in on just one thing. And in narrowing in, if you do your part and I do my part, we will begin to affect change. And that change will grow, and that change will grow. So that was comforting, encouraging to me. And finally, UNC Chapel Hill alumni that I discovered when I was at school at North Carolina State at D.H. Hill Library. I was preparing a paper for a class, and I stumbled across a quote from Lou Barton, who was a Lumbee Indian and a UNC Chapel Hill graduate. And he said, communication is man's greatest gift from God. I've never met an uninteresting person. Communication, crossing bridges, and stepping out despite our fear are all the things that we will need in order to make sure that our democracy endures. And Dr. Lafont, I believe that the many publics that you speak of, I do think they are possible. They may be challenging, it may be as difficult as I don't know, but I believe they're possible, and they begin in the sacred places, our neighborhoods, our communities, the things that we hold dear. Finally, I'll end with this. I live in a townhome community in Greensboro, and I am so grateful because most of the folks that live there are older than me. They remind me of my grandparents. And so I call them my grandparents, and they don't look anything like me. But one of the things is because of how I was reared to respect my elders, I listen to them. I attend their loved ones' homegoing celebrations. And though their practices are not my practices, and their customs may not even appear to be my customs, and what they believe I may not agree with, I listen. Because I truly believe that it will not be us holding up necessarily banners and whatnot. I believe it will be the relationships that we form and dare to enter into that will change the outcomes. And in addition to entering into those relationships that may be difficult and challenging, that we go beyond our fears and we press ahead.
Wow, how to follow this morning's 5 panelists. I'm tempted to just say what they said and move on. Well, what I'd like to do this morning is provide a perspective from my work over a lifetime as a historian of the American South. And a perspective informed by work that I've been doing over the last decade, unfortunately, as an expert witness for the plaintiffs in a whole series of voting rights cases in this state that have been heard in both state and federal court. And I think, and I hope along the way, you'll hear a lot of echoes of points made this morning. What I want to do primarily is put race at the very center of this conversation. And I'm going to go at this at a sort of higher conceptual level, which I hope will make some sense to you, and happy to dig into some of the particulars of the story of race and voting rights in North Carolina in the Q&A. There's much in that story to be inspiring. Particularly the capacity of people in the most hostile circumstances to forge meaningful interracial alliances, and to do so, and by doing so, to extend not only voting rights, but also economic rights, the fullness of citizenship in this state. And it's important to remember that those two have always gone together. Of course, there's also much that's deeply depressing and disturbing in that story about the use of violence to destroy those alliances. And in a sense, even in a more sinister way, the use of the law in ways that on the surface seem to have nothing to do with race. And yet, in the implementation and enforcement of those laws, to work a profound and destructive racial difference. I'll make a shameless plug here. If you really want to dive into the particulars of that story, just a couple of years ago, published a book with colleague Bob Korstad from Duke University called Fragile Democracy. And it's the story of race and voting rights in the state. It came out of the expert witness work. And we both felt that having done that, it was important for it not just to be heard in a courtroom, but to be made available in an accessible book, written to academic standards, but written for a general audience in mind. And I'm going to be on the stand again in the first week of May in the challenge that's pending right now, the challenge to North Carolina's voter ID requirement that's going to be heard in U.S. District Court for the Middle District of North Carolina in Winston-Salem. So let me take a pass at this. You know, today with Donald Trump monopolizing nearly every corner of the news cycle, I mean, it's just extraordinary, the capacity to suck all the oxygen out of the room. It's become almost obligatory for pundits to ask, could it happen here? All right? Could America in the next election turn from democracy to autocracy and authoritarianism? Well, my answer to that question is not only that it might well happen, but in fact, it has happened in this state, in this region, and in this nation historically. The current historical moment reminds me of the 1890s, and most especially of the elections of 1898 and 1900, which in this state established the reign of Jim Crow, a regime that governed, that remained in place for well over half a century. I think ordinarily most Americans, and certainly most white Americans, have thought about the Jim Crow South as simply a racist enclave in an otherwise democratic nation. But Jim Crow was something much more than simply an expression of bigotry. Jim Crow was a system of power and plunder. And I take that second word from Ta-Nehisi Coates, who I think has written brilliantly on this. It was a system of power and plunder established by authoritarian one-party government. And we're not used to saying those things in the history of America, but that's what government in this state and in this region looked like for nearly half a century. Put in place by authoritarian one-party government and enforced by both state and extra-legal violence. It was a system of power and plunder that robbed its black citizens of both wealth and life itself, and in the process immiserated a vast number of poor and working class whites as well. Men and women who accepted what W.E.B. Du Bois called the psychological wage of whiteness for their in exchange for their suffering and their marginalization. And this authoritarian turn in the Jim Crow South was something more than a simple aberration in the story of American democracy. It was instead hardwired into this republic that from its birth had been grounded in an ideology of white supremacy. An ideology of white supremacy that legitimated the enslavement of black Africans and the extermination of indigenous peoples. This ideology of white supremacy even encoded the word freedom in racial and biological terms. Encoded freedom as the birthright of white skin. And it taught even the lowliest white citizens to defend that freedom against encroachment from across the race line, lest they themselves sink into the unfree status of black slaves. And listen to what Martin Luther King had to say about this. It is a brilliant insight and so succinct. I'm quoting from a speech that was titled "Our God is Marching On," 1965, in which he explained to his audience that Southern white supremacist elites gave the poor white man Jim Crow. And when his wrinkled stomach cried out for the food that his empty pockets could not provide, He ate Jim Crow, a psychological bird that told him that no matter how low and how bad off he was, at least he was a white man, better than a black man. And when his undernourished children cried out for the necessities that his low wages could not provide, he showed them Jim Crow signs on the buses and in the stores and on the streets and in the public buildings. And his children, too, learned to feed upon Jim Crow. So said Martin Luther King. That encoding of the idea of freedom, that conflation of whiteness and freedom, served the interests of elite whites who used it not only to establish white rule, but also to determine which whites would rule supreme. And I think that's perhaps the most fundamentally important thing to understand if we want to understand the politics of Jim Crow and white supremacy. And I realize that it sounds here as if I'm preaching the gospel from the 1619 Project, perhaps. Yeah, happy to do it. But I am preaching the gospel of the 1619 Project, but I am preaching it from a very different book. I'm preaching it from a book published in 1975 by the eminent historian of the colonial era and the American Revolution, Edmund Morgan. It's titled American Slavery, American Freedom. And if you don't know it, I commend it to you. I'm also preaching from another book by a former student named Jeff Cowie, who just won the Pulitzer Prize for a book entitled Freedom's Dominion. And it is the story of that conflation of freedom and whiteness in our own time, in the ways in which it has ravaged American democracy. And I think it brings sort of into very sharp focus the way that it might inflict unrecoverable damage to our democracy in early November. That racialized concept of freedom, I think, defines our political moment. It threatens our democracy. And we will not liberate ourselves from it until we reckon fully and honestly with the racism at the heart of our nation's story. Clock's ticking, and it may yet be too late. So let us set about the work. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much to our three panelists. And we do have an opportunity here for Cristina Lafont to give a few responses before we take a very brief pause and then shift into our final conversation.
Okay, so it's hard on that note to say something because I do fear the moment completely. And so I remember when I was asked to give a title for my talk, I sent the title, and then the person, which I don't remember, one of the organizers, but I now don't remember whom, told me, oh, that is a very timely topic, because it was on democracy and the threat and polarization. And then I responded just automatically, it's just becoming too timely for my taste, because it's April and I was already fearing. It's like, well, I don't know what talk one can give after November. So just to say that no matter what else I have been saying since yesterday, I do have the impression that we are risking everything in November. I believe that. And then I don't know what one can be talking about after November. I don't think we can be talking about mini publish or anything else. And in fact, I do fear that I myself may not feel able to stay in this country if things go as bad as I fear they could be. And it may be because of my biography, but I already made it once from authoritarianism to democracy, and I'm not doing the reverse at my age. It's like I'm not doing that. I just go somewhere else. I don't know, whatever. So that's how afraid I am that you are right. Still, I must say that this country, and I'm speaking as a foreigner in a way, I'm an American citizen, of course, because I've been here for 30 years, but I didn't grow up here, and I had to learn a lot about how weird this country is, like every country I have been to. There is, of course, this racism problem that this country has, and this needs to be solved eventually, as we kind of know, right? It looks as if, it's like with women too, like it looks as if, and then after 50 years, we're like, oh, remember, you are a minority, so now we have no physical security and no health security again, right? So you never really finish, right? But so these are the underlying problems that each country has in its own way for its own history. But I really hope people realize that the political system is hardly ever the reason why we have the problems we have. But the political system is how we intervene in the problems we have, whether they be economic or they be cultural or they be social. That's what is special about the political system. It's not that it bears the reasons and the burden for what's going on. It's that the only way we can intervene. And if we lose that, wow, this is not like any other thing we lose. We can lose battles and we can go forward and backward with women's rights and with minority rights and African American rights, but you don't go backward with authoritarianism. Then that's the end of it. It's not a backward, it's just done, right? So that's kind of what I see as a special in thinking about the problem of losing democracy. So that is clear that I don't think it's the source of the problems, but it's the way we act on the problems. And if we lose the way to act that we think is meaningful, then we have lost everything. So that's all I can say, because you're absolutely right. You're speaking to my heart. I mean, I'm petrified of what may happen in November. So, okay, moving from there, which is not easy. Okay, so Simone, I will need to talk more to you to see what you are saying in detail, but so it's fascinating that the more people I talk to, the more they have had experience with mini publish, which is amazing. It tells me, I know, it's happening much more than people think. So you find it all over the place. So what you are kind of saying two things. You are saying, well, there is the danger that experts will overwhelm ordinary citizens because of how much they know. And you give an example even that you yourself saw. I can give you tons of examples that work differently because it very much depends on the topic. If you look at the Irish Convention on Abortion and same-sex marriage, expertise is not the problem. They did have to hear a lot of things from experts, but people have kind of their own kind of moral basis. But in other cases, like some derivative polling that Fisking has done in African countries, where citizens are given with experts a bunch of options of things they can do, for example, for improving public education for children. I remember this case, it was fascinating, because the experts, as much as the politicians, were all about how to increase transportation and improve transportation so that people could be moved to different schools. Guess what? When the women came into the mini parties, they were like, no way. Girls have to be close in the school, otherwise they are not going to go. So you just, no. If you want to improve education for girls, they have to be near the village. They are not going to be sent somewhere because it's too risky for them. No expert have thought about it. They changed completely the policies that where they were going to invest, realizing that they had the priority of getting more girls to school, but in those villages, you were not going to do it if you just invest on transportation. This is going to make male boys maybe go to school, but not girls. So those are the kinds of expertise that the affected have that are very important in many cases. And you can see how experts don't get their say. It depends on what is at stake, right? But there is a problem for capture of experts. However, then you were saying, on the one hand, This is a danger. On the other, maybe that is as good as it should be. Maybe we should listen to experts. Well, I don't think so. I think we should listen to experts for what they are experts for. They are experts about whatever it is that we want to know about, technical questions, right? But they are experts on values and what we need and what we prioritize. They are experts on what we should risk. As you know, with doctors, we listen to doctors, but even if you are unconscious, the doctor cannot make decisions for you. It's your relative, the closest relative will make decisions. Why? Your closest relative is not a doctor, doesn't know anything. Yeah, but the doctor is not going to take risk for you. You have to decide. And doctors tend not to want to have that type of authority. It's like, no, it's your life. I tell you, those are the options. I have never seen a doctor trying to overstep and say, hey, no, do this. You need, whatever, aesthetic surgery, you will look so much nicer. That doesn't happen. Doctors tell you the options and you run your own risk in your life. Well, that is what democracy is. We have to decide what we prioritize, what is worth for us fighting or not. There is no experts on what we want and what we think is worth risking, right? There are no experts. We have to make those decisions. So in that sense, that's how I will go back. Because the problem is, your argument could go in the direction of Guerrero, who is saying, yes, we should have a technocratic rule. We have experts on the one hand, and then we have ordinary citizens. Looks democratic is what I call technopopulism. On the one hand, they are ordinary citizens, so it looks democratic, although you have been disenfranchised for the rest of your life, and it's just very few people who have power. And on the other, the experts then rule, of course, because they know more than anyone else, and they know how to get their way. So I oppose that, and I think one should oppose that, but I wasn't sure in the way you presented it, well, it was just provocative, or maybe you think there is something there. I think we should avoid going autocratic, even if we do use mini publics. I think we could use them in a democratic way. So that's the short answer. And now to Natasha, of course, you're absolutely right. I mean, you are showing what is the infrastructure of democracy, right? Democracy, if you think of it as a kind of political institution, very high up, right? It looks like something very far away from children and us and ordinary people. But in fact, this is just the superstructure. Democracy requires every single thing you have said, right? We have to, and that's what mini publics brings. The reality of what makes some institutions work is that people have those capacities, that they can reach out to those who are different from them, that they can feel empathy for them, they can understand them even though they know they are different, that they can overcome their fears and talk to others. All of that is actually the infrastructure of democracy. You have institutions that are supposed to do that. You couldn't do any of it if human beings cannot do that, and if they don't have those capacities. And that is why education is so important, because the new citizens have to be able to go those bridges, right? And that's why we tend to have faith that young people can actually overcome. They are more like what I call on the fence. They can make up their minds. They are not so invested as they become when they are older, right? And they can freely see. That's why typically new generations are less bigots and more open-minded, and why there is some kind of progress. Just one thing only, that, as I mentioned, I think yesterday, Fiskin is trying mini publics in schools for K-12 education, and bringing it as a way of civic education that goes beyond just giving the content and teaching the content of the Constitution, etc. And I think we need these types of experiences, and we are running out of them because of the bad atmosphere we are in, and those are ways to fight back, I hope. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for those. So I think if everyone is welcome, maybe to take a 5-minute break here, we can kind of reassemble. Lloyd? All right. And feel free to chime in the next session as it simmers. So we'll take 5 minutes here just to get situated, and then come back for our final conversation. Thank you. And let's all give one more hand to these panelists.
Okay, can you hear me? So people are still coming back in, but I'm going to ask people to have a seat. And so what we want to do as we move into this final session is we want people in the room to raise some questions, a little bit like our commentators. What do you see as the particular dangers? What do you see the value of the kind of proposals that Cristina has made? Just what is your response to also to what the panelists have said? Because we've had excellent input from the panelists, and we have, wait, Joanna was going to circulate with, someone circulating with the microphone. She'll be right. Oh, here she is. So we have a microphone here, and we have a first comment. We're going to take a few questions and comments. So we now have a mini public with many questions as if they were all part of the panel, but we're going to widen the discussion. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, David Barrow. In all of these discussions, one of the elements I don't hear, but I hear a cry for, and I advise all of us to study more about this. In some of the Scandinavian countries, they have made academic or professional ethicists an important part of the role of government. For example, the president or whatever of the country, as his right-hand person, has an ethicist. Certain companies, certain other kinds of institutions in our country have some degree of this, usually as a check that they don't get themselves in legal trouble. And surprisingly, the United States government, we talk about who knows which parts of the government exist, there is a Department of Ethics. It's buried deep within the Department of Justice, and almost nobody outside of real experts even know it exists. They tried their best, but I would love to see, for hope for the future in all of these democracies, more exploration of that idea. How do you weave that into government? Because it solves so many of these questions about what is fair, what is right. That's what these people do for a living.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take a few questions and comments. Do we have other, we have one online? We're going to take one from Zoomland. Do you want me to come there with you? Have a mic. Okay, here's a question.
Wait. Sorry. Can everyone hear me? Okay, there we go. So Lisa Hoffman asks, first, thank you for this wonderful opportunity and for your time. As I eagerly join this particular mini public, I'm wondering if some participants who might be registered Republicans might feel uninvited to join the discussion. I believe there's a critical difference between what we label as a party affiliation and the actual individuals out there. In fact, I believe this lack of distinction is perhaps at the heart of the polarization.
So you mean, you're saying, let me make sure I understand the question. What would it be like if you did not label someone as Republican or Democrat? Would a Republican be welcome in this conversation, in this mini public? Is that the question? Yeah. Okay. We'll come back to that point as well. There's a question over here. Where's our other? Oh, here you are. Oh my gosh. Couldn't even figure out where.
I want to throw out a counter argument that politics is amoral by definition. It's not immoral. It's political. The rules of politics are political science are amoral.
That's an observation. We'll keep back whether there's a problem of morality. Any other comment? Yes, over here.
About your optimism with respect to the capacity for mini publics to change people's minds about like fundamental matters of justice or matters of like fundamental moral fact, like who has moral rights, you know, whether animals are morally considerable. Because I was thinking in a lot of the cases of mini publics that you offer, what's at issue are sort of issues that involve both descriptive and like normative claims. So I'm wondering if you think when citizens are really deeply divided by disagreements about moral matters of fact, whether mini publics can also help in those cases.
Okay, you've got several questions. There's another question here. Then we'll let you respond maybe, and then we'll come around to some more questions.
Century guy. I'm not part of any computer or cell phone participation.
Wow.
I was glad to receive in the Postal Service notes of this conference or symposium. So I'm wondering, is there a mini public that I could be part of here? In
Is
an
there a
ongoing
mini
way?
public in our own community?
Yes.
You mean that? Oh, yes, we have mini publics, mini publics.
All right, well, name 3 and how to contact them. If you don't mind.
Oh, no, I thought you meant, no, I don't know about I was thinking you meant like publics like this conversation, but let's ask for other people to help us on that. Yeah.
We've talked about random choice of members of many publics that you've described earlier. I'd like to randomly choose myself to be part of one of those mini publics. I don't know what they are, where they are,
Yeah.
or how to find out about them.
So I think this raises the interesting question, how are people chosen to be in a mini public? How do they become aware that such mini publics actually exist? Like here we have a question, I never even knew there was such a thing. And I guess the third question is related to that. How will these mini publics actually have an impact either on changing people's minds or in policy? The North Carolina legislature may or may not have any interest in a mini public that someone creates, even in their own neighborhood. So do you want to respond to a few of those questions and then think of more questions and we'll bring you back?
I may start with these last questions because are more technical about mini publics. So mini publics in particular have to be randomly selected. But there are other venues that are similar of participation of ordinary citizens that are not randomly selected, which means people can volunteer, so they are self-selected. For example, participatory budgeting. This is an initiative that started in Brazil and in the city of Chicago, many, like in the 70s. And now it's happening in many cities. The one I live in Evanston, now there is participatory budgeting, is tried. The only country in the world that I'm aware of who is trying participatory budgeting at the national level is Portugal. So in those cases, you could, if there was participatory budgeting implemented anywhere here in the city you are registered, you could participate just because you want to. I got an email from the city of Evanston saying we are doing participatory budgeting. So in the normal case, it's very local. And the idea is that the city or the municipality reserves an amount of money, I don't know, like $2 million, to be determined by ordinary citizens who participate to say what their priorities are. How should we use this, say, $2 million? But in principle, obviously, the model could go all the way to say, how do we do the budget of the country? Portugal, which is the first country doing it at the country level, is not asking the whole budget, obviously, but the allocation is huge because it's a whole country allocation, even though it's just a part, right? So those are experiments of how people can get engaged and involved in actually deciding those difficult questions about how you allocate the budget, because it becomes clear very quickly that ideally you will have to have much more money for all the things you want, but then you have to make the tough decisions that there's not enough money to everything everybody wants. So those are voluntary in that sense. You can self-select. And there are others where there is self-selection. The reason why mini publics do not go for self-selection is because obviously if that were to go somewhere, the risk of self-selection is that bad actors, people who are very committed to a particular outcome, will be the ones, self-selecting. And then you will lose that sense that people who really participate are participating in good faith because they had no agenda. And so that has good things and bad things. One bad thing about mini publics is that it does not connect well with grassroots movements, because you want people mobilized. I mean, that's what a grassroots movement is. Mini publics are randomly selected, so typically are people who are not mobilized. That's what you are looking for. However, in the combination that I was referring yesterday, they could be partners for mobilized people, because you don't need that the members of the mini public themselves, particularly those 20 people, are the mobilized ones. They can do a job for us, for those who really are mobilized and are bringing initiatives, etc. Right? So in that combination, for me, it works well. But that's the reason why people cannot volunteer to mini publics to make sure that you have a representative sample of the population and not just those who are very invested on a particular outcome, self-selecting.
Before we go on, could I just ask for local knowledge here? Has anyone been aware of many publics in this community? You have someone?
Durham has participatory budgeting.
They have a budget for participatory mini publics in Durham?
Well, they have participatory budgeting in Durham.
Yeah. So does anyone else know, is there anything in Orange County or Chapel Hill? Do you, Diane? Here, let me bring you the mic because this has to go on.
Now we're attached. I just want to comment that the point that it's being made about mini publics is that they're organized in a randomized way so that they are, I imagine, representative. What you have in all of our counties and local government, which is one of the things that I think is threatening our democracy, it's who shows up, who knows about it, who has the time to come to participate. They're not randomly selected. So as a result, those that are elected and the consultants that they pay tons of your taxpayer money to do things still have the point of view of those who have the privilege of showing up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a huge
That's
problem,
right. So it's
self-selection.
not like a school board meeting where people just show up or something. So this is a good question. What would it look like to have more in our own community? So I just wondered if. Yeah. So the question is, how are there institutions in our community where you can have conversations with those you disagree? We're coming back to you, but this is a participatory moment here.
Yes.
Neil, yeah.
Organization called Braver Angels. I don't know if any of you
Braver
have heard of it.
Angels.
braverangels.org. They have workshops. One workshop is called a red-blue workshop, where they get people who identify as red, i.e. conservative, and blue, liberal, equal numbers, and they talk about each other's beliefs and about each other's stereotypes of the other side. Very interesting workshop. Another one is called dealing with your inner polarizer. That's where you don't get together necessarily with people of the opposite side, but you look at your own biases and stereotypes. And then finally, they have a third type of event, which are debates, where they talk about a controversial, and these are typically online, a controversial topic, let's say abortion, and they have a very structured debate where they take turns, a blue-leaning person, a red-leaning person, then back and forth, making 2 or 3 minute statements with a couple minutes of questions and so on. So it's that's kind of a mini public. The only thing is that none of that is filtered up to any legislative layer. So it's really just done for the benefit of the participants so that they can understand, maybe get a better understanding of all the issues around a particular topic. The first 2 workshops I described are in-person events. The debates are typically online. Yeah.
So the Better Angels, though, is an important.
Braver Angels.
Braver.
They started out as Better
Braver.
Angels, but that name was already trademarked. They found out it was trademarked, so they had to change it to Braver.
Are there other Braver Angels in the room? Has anyone, you've been to, you went to a meeting, that's right. So what makes a Braver Angel meeting? That's not quite what you're talking about, but
Yes.
it does affect people's opinion, right?
Right, there is more self-selection, obviously, which is potentially a problem if it were to have any power. I mean, if not, the way Braver Angels is organized, and I have been told to participate, and I did participate once, and I get then you get the emails all the time if you want to keep participating. The beauty of it is that because it aims at education, at civic education, at people actually going through the experience of what is it like to actually have to defend your views in front of people who have different views, etc. I think it's perfect, and it's no problem that it's self-selected, because ideally you want every single citizen to go through this type of experience, at least sometimes in their lives, right? And so in that sense, for me, it's perfect. Braver Angels is great. The problem is outreach. How do you get to, how long is it going to take for Braver Angels to have reached, I don't know, half of the population of America? I don't know. Maybe there's not enough interest. People may not know it, etc. But as a tool for civic education is perfect. If you wanted it to have some kind of power to make recommendations, then you care a lot about who is participating. But if you want the participants, whoever they are, however biased or not they are, etc., to actually make the experience, I think there is nothing that speaks against it. But you see the difference, right?
So it doesn't have an official role, but if millions of people were in braver angel conversations, part of your
Things will be
goal
very
would be.
different, yes, and that is the goal.
Yeah. But there would need to be more. We'll come back to, were you going to speak about braver angels, or you have some, could we come back to that? Because I want you to
have
answer
a
a couple
list.
of other questions over here about
Right.
both ethicists and also the question of people who have very different moral views.
Yes. Okay. On the issue of how to contact people who don't use any electronics, the mini publics people are very concerned with it. So on the one hand, they are working on making possible to have mini publics online so that they reach out and it's cheap for everybody. And I think that's good. But on the other, there is an age and a bias here that you are losing all people who are in rural conditions where they don't have access to those things, right? And that is a huge problem if you are trying to build a mini public. So they are very aware, and they try to find ways to reach out to people who are not having, I don't know, email or those kinds of things. So they make it, and it is possible, and they do it. They reach out to people just by going knocking on their doors. So what they use is voter eligibility. So they have the voter register, they do these kinds of things, or the census, or things like this. So it is a real issue, and they are aware of it, because otherwise you would lose a big chunk of the population who may not be contacted. Okay, so on the thing, ethics in government. I'm a philosopher, and a political philosopher on top of it. So I wouldn't say that politics is, or politicians or politics is immoral. I don't think so. But the problem with ethicists is that there's a difference between knowing how and knowing that. And so if by ethicist you mean a professional, ethics professor, that professional will have knowing that. He could tell you everything about, if he's a good ethicist, about all kinds of ethical positions that can be defended, but they are very different ones. However, to be an ethicist in your sense, or an issue, people need to have experience. They need to have know-how. For example, I was once confronted with a very difficult situation, a medical situation, which is typical where people use ethicists on end-of-life decisions for my mother. And that is when I realized, and I'm a philosopher, and I did moral philosophy at the time, I realized the disconnect between knowing that and knowing how. And I could not imagine anyone being an expert on the problem my family was confronting vis-a-vis what to do with my mother. Really, they couldn't be an expert on that. And so that is a limitation. So, however, that doesn't speak against it. The worry I will have, I think, ethicists and ethical panels, we have them in health issues all the time. I mean, that's the area where you absolutely cannot do anything without them. So I'm not against it. I'm just very aware, because of my own profession, of the limitations. And another that will matter is what type of ethical point of view the ethicist has, because we who do moral philosophy know that there are many different ones, and we have never been able to agree. Right? If you are a utilitarian or you are a deontologist, we are never going to agree, because by now it's like 3,000 years. So I doubt this is going to be sorted out anytime soon. And so then it will be crucial to make sure that if you are going to have an ethicist panel, you have different views. You have somebody being a deontologist and a utilitarian, and not just only utilitarians, which is the fear one will have, etc. Right? I mean, so, but other than that, it's true that you need moral knowledge too when you are making political decisions. So it wouldn't be bad, but I would be very worried about how politically representative those ethicists and who chooses them and which orientation they have. Deeply divided, do people change their minds? Yes. I mean, you can check and look exactly, because that was in the New York Times. So Fiskin has done 2 times something called America in One Room. And it's with 500 people on political issues, which usually is not what they do. They do other type of issues like energy or whatever, right? But this one was before the past election, to see what happens when Republicans and Democrats and independents as such, ascribed as such by themselves, get together, America in one room, right? And discuss the most contentious issues, immigration, I mean, exactly ones you want to know, abortion, whatever, and what happens. And they publish it in the New York Times. The problem is that people don't know why that matters and why it's interesting, and so I doubt that a lot of people read it. But if you check it out, you can get it. Or also in their Stanford website for the Derivative Center that Fiskin runs, you can find America in One Room. And they have done it twice. And so what happens is that Republicans move a lot, but Democrats move too, and they become less polarized on the hotly issues like immigration. I mean, the worst possible, they pick all of them to see what happens. And so people do actually change their minds. That doesn't mean everyone, obviously not, but this is sufficiently indicative of how less polarized people could be, even on the issues that are hot issues, if they were able to talk to one another in a particular environment, right?
Okay, thank you. So there is evidence that people can change. That's encouraging. There's some additional questions. Let's take a few more comments and then we'll respond to those. There's one up here.
I did not answer the person online asking whether Republicans.
Right. There was one online. Could you answer that?
Yes,
I'm sorry. Would a Republican,
will be welcome? Absolutely. I mean, not only. I mean, if I were in a mini public, it will be ensured by design that people will have different political orientations, or else it's not a mini public. So I absolutely am in favor, and I welcome that. Yeah.
Definitely. It wouldn't work if there weren't
No,
Republicans
be a
as
mini
well as
public,
Democrats.
100%
That's the whole point.
Yeah.
Okay. Comment up here.
I taught American history in high school for 35 years. And the message that I always tried to get across to my students as we looked at history in this country, that we were moving to a greater democracy, greater perfection of our ideals. I always wanted them to be hopeful. And we would talk about events and how perhaps this event led to a greater goodness in the country. Those that were obviously cruel, we would recognize that as well. And I think today what troubles me more than anything, in light of what I wanted my kids to love and learn, is that I don't see a fight back or against a kind of cruelty that I see. I know when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, that personalized slavery for Northerners, it was a major turning point in knowing that they had to retrieve a slave and give it back. It personalized it, and they were not willing to tolerate that cruelty. I looked at the dogs in, the sheriff in some southern place, I've even forgot what state it was, and Americans could not stand to look at that cruelty on TV. It was that cruelty, personalized, that got this country to move in the right direction. And so what troubles me is I'm not seeing that now. Leaders make jokes, make fun of people. We're not fighting that back anymore. Am I wrong? Am I getting too gloomy or too negative? Because I spent my life thinking that my country was moving in the direction, in the words that you quoted. And social justice for me, always, I was a United Methodist. We were known historically to be social justice people, Hillary Clinton being one that I kind of was proud of. We were social justice people. I called it the absence of cruelty, the attempt on the part of a nation to lessen cruelty.
Mm-hmm.
For me. So I'm not seeing that now. I'm seeing an acceptance of it. It's okay to make fun of a disabled person. It's okay to call people ugly names. And we're not fighting back that. So for me, inherent in democracy, there's supposed to be a kindness, maybe that's not the right word, but a respect, a deep respect of the other person. And that's why discussion amongst us, in reference, following up his question, is hard, because sometimes when you face people who disagree with you, their cruelty is unlimited. And it's very difficult to sit down and have these open discussions because of the cruelty that can emerge. And that's why when I hear where is the public discourse, I think we withdraw from it because of what we can expect to be accused of, to be minimized, to be demonized, really is the better word. And so that to me is the most frightening thing to me that we face. And that's an ethical, moral issue. And I don't know how we deal with that. And I include my church in the pot because you can have some of the most hurtful, angry comments about gay people inside a church. That's where they are. And I don't know what, because that's not how I grew up on this campus.
Right.
I was here when in the middle of the civil rights movement, and I remember at one of the drugstores in downtown Chapel Hill on Franklin Street. Sorry, I was going to get, anyway, an African-American kid was up against the door in a sit-in. And the guy who owned the store or whatever, and I don't remember what the store was, it doesn't matter, took that door and shoved that door and broke his back. And that mobilized this campus. I remember it as good as it was yesterday.
Oh, okay, thank you. I want to see actually if, that's good. And do you want to respond to that? I know maybe our panel, did you want to respond also, Diane, or you? Cristina, and then we'll come. You had a. All right. Let's have one direct response, concise direct response,
Yes.
and then.
And I think it was on one of your slides, Christina, the presence of a moderator. That and many of us have been in these kind of things. There has to be somebody there who makes you play fair and avoid exactly what you're talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
That's true for many publics, absolutely. That's why things work differently and people are not afraid, because moderators are not going to allow any of it. And they know that, they feel safe. However, I wanted to give you some hope in society. I have two examples in my book. One, of course, as we all know, from TV, the effect that TV had when people in the North could see, and young people could see these little girls but with the dogs following them in the water, right? What effect that had. Okay, we have had that now with cell phones. People can take pictures and videos of how police is mistreating people, and look at what happened. It created a movement in the whole world reacting to the killing of Michael Floyd, right? This is the kind of thing that, in my view, you can never expect every single person to be perfect or be good or be democratic. You don't need that, and it's not achievable. All you need is that there is enough people on the fence that you can mobilize when they see something like this. And every technical improvement creates that type of situation where a lot of people who will be otherwise on the fence, who are on the fence? First, the new generations. They aren't born already with vested interest in what happened to them. They are children, and they are on the fence on many issues, and that's why things change. All of those on the fence, when they see those videos taken directly from police brutality, they react. And it's not their problem. No, they react to the injustice in the same way that they reacted in the 60s. So there is some hope. All you need is enough people on the fence willing to move from the fence to actually do something, right? And many other people won't. They just will die eventually. I think that's kind of what happens.
But it is true. Images are very powerful, and what you're describing is that. Diane, you wanted to have a comment on this issue also?
Perception is very compartmentalized. And with the exception of a few things like George Floyd on cell phones and that extreme, the day-to-day diet of people's information is MSNBC, CNN, Fox. And if you are only on those networks, you're not seeing George Floyd in the same way you're seeing it on something else. So your ability to galvanize and to empathize around less dramatic issues, but equally important, how Fox interprets the person who makes fun of the disabled in the rally was completely different. In fact, it wasn't even shown on Fox News. So that good-hearted Republican with a small r who might feel like they would respond didn't get that information. So their brain is not taking in and empathizing in the way that someone who sees it differently. And I think that's a big part of what's happening, is that how we're being socialized by the media that we are absorbing is changing the way people's brains work. And those babies, my grandsons, they have lots more empathy than children, young people who are older, who've already been hardened by not getting that continual empathy.
Paul says we have a couple of questions also on the Zoom. Thank you for that.
I just
Natasha, yeah, go ahead.
So in response to that, as a teacher, one of the things in the classroom is setting those expectations. And what I find is once I establish relationships with my students, out of the respect that they have for me, they honor those expectations and in turn can respect each other. Just an example, the State of the Union recently, where the Speaker of the House actually set a tone for Republicans. And I thought it was one of the best State of the Unions. I was expecting more pushback from the Republican Party when Biden was giving the State of the Union, but I thought it was not what I thought it was better than what I expected. And one of the reasons is because the leader set the tone of what we are not going to have. And I think it takes more of that. I think it takes more people setting those expectations and saying, I'm not. And give you an example, I'm old fashioned too. And one of the things is I remember my mother instilling this, is that you don't do that. You don't do that. So when others are laughing or whatever, you hold your ground. You don't. And that may seem very small, a small step, but I think that's where it begins. And if each person does their small step, we can have more consensus. And so it may not be, I think the bad apple looks like it's going to spoil the whole bunch, but it doesn't have to. It does not have to.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And a teacher has to deal with that all the time too, to make everybody feel they're included and there's no cruelty in the classroom. Paul, you had a couple, you want to share two questions?
Yeah, there's two quick questions. One is just who are the they that organize the mini publics? They do not just happen. And then the other question is, do you honestly think that we'd be able to establish a multiracial democracy in this country without having to resort to violence, i.e. rebellion, revolution, civil war?
Well, there's one fairly specific question and one pretty big one.
I start with the
Do you want to
first,
respond
which is
to both of those?
Yeah.
And then if there's another question, we'll come back. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so the organizers are agencies who specialize in this type of mini publics. For example, in the case of derivative polling, if you think that derivative polling is the best or the type of derivative mini public that you like the most, which is a plausible position to take, then Jim Fiskin has invented this mini public and owns it. And so if you want to have a derivative poll, you contract Jim Fiskin and his group that organize it the way that they are responsible for working as they think. And for example, in Mongolia now, it's part of their constitution that you cannot try to have a constitutional amendment in Mongolia if you do not organize first a deliberative poll, which means Fiskin has to go and organize it. And the thing is, so the same is for citizens' assemblies, citizen panels. They have been invented by typically political scientists in most of the cases, and they have groups of people who organize them. And in that sense, if you like the model, what you get out of they organizing it is that they guarantee that it's done that way. No one can corrupt them. You cannot ask Fiskin to change stuff, because Fishkin owns it, and it's very important to Fishkin that it works exactly as his model is. And so that has this type of independence from the politicians, the public authorities who call on organizing it. They have no say on how it is run. Otherwise, there will be no credibility. There can be problems, but I mean, in that sense, that's how it works.
So just one thing, is there a
Yeah.
website you can go to that
Absolutely.
if you
The
Google,
Pauline?
how do I organize a mini public?
Oh my
or
God, oh, yeah, you're gonna
All
get
right.
a million
How-
responses.
Are there people
It's a big thing.
organizing mini publics in my state or something like that? You could Google that.
I actually checked it before coming, because these days I'm curious, because it's all over the place. And so you guys here in North Carolina, but I don't know at which level. I didn't have time enough to get it. For health decisions, there are many publics organized, but that's why it doesn't really get into the public knowing about it. But this seems to be, and I saw a whole report, but I was like, whatever, I was on a particular type of health decision that they organize a mini public. I don't know which model, but so it's all over the place actually, but we needed to be more known and organized for issues that citizens care about, more well-known issues, etc. But yeah, you can check absolutely.
Okay, and the other question was, is it possible to build a truly multiracial, multicultural democracy in America without violence, civil war? Is that,
Yeah.
I suppose many publics are designed to avoid violence.
That's for
But
sure.
what do you think social change can take place?
Yeah.
Clearly, you must, without violence, but how do you respond to that question? Civil
Well,
war.
Right. I mean, frankly, there are two questions involved. One is, will it take a civil war to happen? That's a kind of prediction. I don't know. In my own country, we had a civil war, and that's how then democracy came after 40 years dictatorship. So given that experience, I'm not sure I will recommend it, right? Because you go into civil war, but there is no direct connection between civil war and getting democracy. And so you go into civil war, and on top of it, then you get 40 years dictatorship. So for example, simply in Spain. And then that's how long you wait. So I recommend the democratic way, because if you go the democratic way, however imperfect you get it, it is the democratic way. But when you go the violent way, you may get things much worse than the other. But so I don't engage in predictions. I have no idea. I'm not a social scientist also. But in terms of normatively seen, where should we put our bets on? I do think it should be on democracy, because at least then you are improving democracy rather than getting the opposite, for example, which will be worse.
Okay, and there is a movie now about civil war. So I want to come back to, it's called Civil War,
Yes,
yes.
it's called Civil War.
And has anyone seen this movie?
No.
No.
Just
I don't
came
think
out
it's
last
come.
weekend.
It hasn't come out.
No, I think it's this weekend.
I
This
did read
weekend.
a lot about the earlier Civil
It's
War.
coming out this weekend.
This
I
week,
think,
okay.
But
Now we'll come back to your question because, yeah.
Movies reviewed in the current New Yorker, not very positively. The premise of this whole 2 days in saving democracy has been that we should talk to each other and solve our problems with conversation. I'm wondering, that will appeal to people who like to talk and reason and solve problems. I'm wondering if that isn't really the first step. I wonder if we created environments or contexts where people worked together, like Habitat for Humanity or soup kitchens or public gardens or cleaning up parks, working together, getting to know each other without the burden of solving society's problems. Just, the relationships would lead to conversations as a second step.
no, absolutely. I mean, I'm going back to the idea that the infrastructure of democracy is all of those things that need to be happening and that are shaping whether or not we are able to talk to one another or not. So adding some particular institution is something we may do or not, and it may help us for some things, but it's no substitution for actually people doing things together and getting to know each other, solving their problems. I mean, we need that. And we are not in a good place, but still, I mean, that infrastructure is still there. So if things don't get out of control, we can rebuild it, right? That's what I hope for.
And that gives people a place to start of something they share, something they have in common. They care about
What
this
they wanna
park, they
accomplish.
care about this garden, they They care about this sports team. You meet a lot of people at basketball games sometimes too. That's not a mini public, but it's important here. Yes, question over here.
We may do a lot of this talking, but I think it doesn't get us where we need to be as long as we have gerrymandering. You're giving a certain segment of the people power, and they want more power. And that's what you see in North Carolina right now. Also, the Electoral College. What about term limits? I think we have some things built in that are working against us.
So those are institutional issues, the way gerrymandering unfolds, and the Electoral College at the national level, which opens the door repeatedly
Yes.
to non-majoritarian outcomes.
Yes, and we have also a Supreme Court with a
And the
6-3
Supreme Court, if you want to add
supermajority.
another
Yes.
issue.
I mean,
So how do you respond to those questions? And
Okay,
can many publics help?
yes, the thing is, your question, as always with politics, has two dimensions. One is what will be a good solution? Another is, where is the power? Is there a chance that we get a shot at that? So for gerrymandering, mini publics is the solution in my view, because you can have some independent commission. That is so much better because it influences results to have ordinary citizens being the independent commission, so to say, because in a way, as we all know, depending on how you draw maps, also for electoral systems. So the most famous and first citizens' assemblies as we know them now were organized in Canada for deciding changes, potential changes in the electoral system. And of course, no matter which electoral system you choose, it will make a difference in the outcomes, right? It's not obvious, it's not direct, depends on over the years, right? But obviously, that's why it matters. So they had these citizens' assemblies going over 2 years with the very same people because electoral systems are so complicated and people have no opinions about. Even the very experts don't know enough about the consequences, etc. So they had to be educated. And the problem was that for the referendum then, on what the mini public had recommended, they needed a supermajority of 60%. And they got 57, I think. And so there was a majority of the population who wanted to follow the change in the electoral system that the mini public had recommended, but it didn't make it to be the supermajority that was required. So I think that drawing maps, which is always going to be politically impactful, there is no real neutral way. We cannot give it to a machine, okay? The independent way of doing that is owned by citizens, is if you have a mini public, because you trust these citizens like you of all kind of representative, etc. So it's perfect for those type of options. So we could have that. However, will the stars be aligned that it turns to be in the interest of all parties to decide to give that decision to a mini public? Well, we may get a shot. It has happened in some places, because the good thing about mini publics, I hope it's clear to all of you, is that there is no way for in advance to know what the outcome is going to be, what they are going to recommend, how are they going to work. And so in that way, it can be sold to any political orientation, because in fact, there is no built-in political orientation in the outcome. And so if we are lucky enough, that will be a solution in that way, that I think it will be legitimate. But will the stars align and where? I don't know. But it's a big problem, of course.
Well, there is an attempt now to create a new constitutional convention. But the answer to that is
Right
no. That's not a mini public. That's another group of elites
Oh my God,
promoting
I mean,
a certain.
Yeah, I don't recommend
We're not going to go there on that
I don't
issue.
recommend that.
So I think we're about at the end of our time. Do you have any final? Are you leaving North Carolina with optimism? You've heard a lot about our history.
In a way, yes, because look at this room and look at the questions and everything. I'm getting out optimistic. It all depends on November.
So
But otherwise, I am
Carolina
optimistic.
Public Humanities is determined to keep the conversation going, and that's all we can hope to do. I want to thank all of the people who spoke on the panels today: Meredith Sheeks, Mark Hetherington, Diane Robertson, Simone Gubler, Natasha Miller, James Laludis. And I want to thank those of you who've been joining us online for your comments and questions. And above all, I want to thank Cristina Lafont for coming to join us and generating a public discussion. Thank you very much for being here. And thank you all.